Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 8 and our last week in the course. So we are in the part 7 of our textbook, and this week we are going to be covering chapters 26, 27, and 28. So let's get started with chapter 26. This chapter examines intergovernmental fiscal relations. Let's start with our focus question 26.1. How are the responsibilities for providing public goods and services shared between the federal government and the states? This question has all to do with the all-important concept of federalism, right? The role of federalism in our republic is central, not only in the way that the government is structured, but also in the way that fiscal procedures and the way that money and taxes flow throughout the economy. This is known as fiscal federalism. In the United States, we have what we call a marble cake type federalism, more so than a layer cake federalism. Although there are some aspects of our fiscal federalism that is more layered, but in general, the U.S. is a marble cake federalism because you have this interconnectedness between federal, state, and local government. So what are some of these examples? Well, for example, you have matching grants. These are grants that the federal government will provide to the states. The federal government might choose to provide a grant that will pay for 50% of the expenditures of a program, for example, and the state will match the federal contribution. The federal government also provides block grants, and these are grants provided to states for meeting specific needs and or things that the federal government deems important. And there's also other ways that the federal government can support the states, and that is through general revenue sharing. And these are other grants that the government will provide. The federal government will provide to the states for certain specific types of expenditures. So there's many ways that the federal government can support the states and local governments through this very complex system of federalism and what we call marble cake federalism in the U.S. Focus question 26.2. What are the economic principles that ought to govern the assignment of responsibilities? When can there be efficient decentralization of decision-making concerning the provision and financing of public services? Well, the economic principles that govern fiscal federalism have to do with the thinking about public goods, right? The role of government, the general justification, the general role of government is to internalize externalities, right? To provide the proper and the necessary conditions for the market to prosper and operate. But aside from that, it's to provide those goods and services that are either not provided by the market or the market cannot provide efficiently, right? And so in doing this, the government provides public goods, right, or finances public goods. Some of these are national, some of these are local, some of these are even international, right? And when we think about the U.S. as a member of a global community, there are some public goods that are global, international in nature, like world peace, for example. That's an international public good, and all countries seek to promote it and to foster it. So one way that economists analyze this, right, and the role is looking at the Thibault hypothesis, and the Thibault hypothesis states that competition among communities ensures efficiency in the supply of these local public goods, just like competition among firms ensures efficiency in the supply of private goods. So this very intuitive hypothesis basically says that if we apply the same efficiency principle that we apply in the market for privately owned and provided goods to publicly provided goods, then we can achieve these excellent externalities, positive externalities, right? And reduce market failures as much as possible. Of course, it's as we have talked about throughout this course, it's impossible to eliminate market failures completely, right? We know that market failures produce externalities, and these externalities are often negative. We also know that because of imperfect competition, we have, for example, limited number of communities, right? So imperfect competition among communities will also produce inefficiencies, natural inefficiencies in the provision of public goods. Tax competition also may lead to lower taxes on businesses, right? So this is good. This is what we want. We want businesses or localities, for that matter, to compete for businesses, and so the more competition for firms, the better the competition, or the better the market will be, and the better we will be as consumers and citizens, because more competition will likely generate downward pressure on taxes. And of course, with free migration and local competition for firms and for workers, you get a natural redistribution process going on, right? And this happens, of course, at the state level, but also at the local level. If you think about, for example, taxation between one jurisdiction and another, right? Folks usually vote with their feet, and folks usually move to lower tax jurisdictions, right? Where they are able to keep more of their income, and jurisdictions that provide the necessary goods and services that they seek and desire, but not having to pay the high tax burden. 26.3. What role should the federal government undertake in redistributing income from rich states to poor states? How does the federal government subsidize states now, and how effective are these subsidies? So these are difficult questions, right? Because these questions are inherently political, or partisan, or politicized. And so one side of the political aisle might argue that the federal government should play a greater role in redistributing income from rich states to poor states, while others might argue that it is up to the states, and that each state has not only the right but also the responsibility to keep its house in order, so to speak, and it's not fair that the federal government be giving to states or supporting or promoting inefficiencies in some states where other states are being efficient and responsible. So these are hard questions to answer. So what is the role of government? Well, the role of government, as we've said many times before, is about redistribution, right? Or distributing the income in the manner that is not only promotes equality of opportunities, but also that we have some at least some level of equity, right? We don't want to have folks simply left out, right? Fall through the cracks, right? So and the role of the government is to address inequality among individuals, right? Inequality across communities, right? We don't want poor communities and rich communities. We don't want some cities to prosper and others to decay. Right? Of course, this is not easy again because of the politics and the philosophical arguments that drive these perspectives, right? For example, the idea of specific egalitarianism, which some argue is tantamount to socialism or even communism, right? Should we promote a system and a situation where everybody, every state, every jurisdiction is the same and has the same, right? So there's arguments on both sides of that, right? Government should promote consumer sovereignty. Consumer sovereignty gives people power to decide and choice, and that is good. That is democracy. That is freedom. And if you have economic freedom, then you're likely to have political freedom as well. So we seek to promote consumer sovereignty, right? And also, we, as government, we want to reduce any inefficiencies that might come about from location. So location inefficiencies should be addressed in this role of government. Okay, so chapter 27 discusses subnational taxes and expenditures. Let's see what these focus questions are. What is the incidence of various taxes imposed at the state and local levels? So here we're talking about incidence, right? And remember, incidence is the impact. Who bears the tax, right? What is the end result of a tax? Okay, so incidence of state and local taxes, right? Think about immobile factors, right? The immobile factors bear all local taxes, okay? So things that cannot be moved very quickly, the factors of production that cannot be moved, that are not so easily or readily able to go from one place to another. Okay, for example, capital is likely to be very mobile. Okay, skilled labor is likely to be relatively mobile as long as people have opportunities and access, at least relatively low cost access to mobility, right? If it's not so expensive to move. On the other hand, land is immobile. It's completely immobile, right? And so these are the factors of production that bear all of the local taxes, land. So in the traditional Ricardian economic factors of production perspective, land, labor, and capital, you have capital is very mobile. Skilled labor is not so necessarily mobile, although with a global economy, a globalized economy and lower cost of transportation, it's become more mobile now than it used to be. But land is very immobile, okay? So when you apply this principle, factors in elastic supply do not bear much of the brunt of taxation. So because with perfect mobility, supply elasticity is infinite. Okay, so when people are able to simply go immediately at low cost and they are able to move from one place to the next, they will not bear the burden of the tax. They simply go to a lower tax jurisdiction, and that's the end of it. Okay, and so what does this do? Well, it limits ability to redistribute income locally. Because again, people will move to another jurisdiction very quickly. What is the incidence of various benefits provided by states and localities? Okay, this has to do with capitalization of taxes and local public goods, right? So what we are seeking to we're seeking to create public capital, to generate public good capital, so to speak, right? To capitalize on all of these investments that we make in the provision and the creation of public goods. And in doing so, we have to think about the future benefits, right? What are going to be the future benefits of our investment or our savings, for that matter? If we are paying taxes, it's a forced savings, and so this forced savings is going to have an impact on consumption in the future benefits, right? The tax base has an impact on the price of land, right? So if you have a jurisdiction where people make relatively good salaries, those salaries are going to generate taxes in that locality, and a demand for, if you have good paying jobs, it's going to create a demand for land. And so the price of land will go up. The higher the price of land, the higher the taxation on property rights. And so this has an impact on future benefits. We also have to look at the difference between debt and tax financing. So, as we have said in the past, politicians prefer to finance their operations and finance their government budgets through debt, because nobody likes to tax, right? Politicians don't necessarily like taxation as an option, because taxation is not something that citizens like. And so debts, financing the budgets with borrowing more, even though it does have an impact on future citizens, but there is a very little impact on the present. And of course, the political lifetime, the lifespans are very different than the real lifespans, right? Politicians want to get elected today and stay elected today, and they can worry about the future. Let other people worry about the future, right? So there's that dilemma of deciding to finance budgets between debt and taxes, right? All of this has an impact on investment value, right? And so the higher taxes eats away at current investment. If you're taxing certain capital investments, that's going to reduce the demand for those types of investments. And so, but at the same time, you don't want people to invest all the money and not consume or save. And so you have to balance out that as well. And then, of course, the short run versus long run impacts, right? If you are heavy on long run benefits, that may create a negative burden on the short term consumer and citizen, right? Because maybe you're not consuming in the current period because you are saving for the future period, for the long run. And so if you're not consuming, that may lower, for example, taxation on sales taxes, right? Which hurts states and local governments a great deal. And so you have to look at short run versus long run impacts in this sense, and looking at, for example, federal policy on interest rates, right? If you want to stimulate the economy, short run stimulation usually comes with lowering the interest rate to get people to consume, to get people to borrow, so that they can consume today, right? Maybe do home improvements or expand their businesses, right? So there's different things that you can do to stimulate short run versus long run impacts. Okay. Focus question 27.3. To the extent that voters are aware of the true incidence of local taxes and benefits, how does the incidence affect the equilibrium level of expenditures and taxation? How does the answer depend on whether the median voter is an owner or a renter? So this is a long question, and I'll try to answer it in a simple form. and this has to do with public choice, right? Why does it make a difference whether the voter is a renter and or a landowner? And the reason it makes a difference is because it has all to do with who bears the tax. If you have a market that is highly driven by land owners, and everybody's renting homes instead of buying homes, then the landowners are the ones who are going to bear the taxes, because when you rent a house, you don't pay the taxes. It's the owner of the house that pays the taxes. So renting a home, while you don't own it, but you don't bear that tax burden, right? So it depends, right? It depends on who is voting and what kind of a distribution you have in that jurisdiction. Do you have a lot of people owning homes? Do you have a lot of people renting? Right? We have some jurisdictions where income levels and perhaps credit ratings are not so high, and that leads to more rental markets than home ownership markets, right? The role of imperfect competition leads to diversity of benefits too, and that, and as we said in the previous slide, as you have imperfect competition, you're going to have some firms benefiting more than others. You might have some firms or some individuals with monopoly power, and so you're going to have a diversity of benefits where some individuals are benefiting more than others from that tax base. What are these special problems arising from multi-jurisdictional taxation? Well, if you look at a place like beautiful New York, right? New York City, right? New York City is a city within a county, within a state, right? And so you have, of course, and within the United States of America. And so you have these multiple layers, right? So this is a multi-jurisdictional taxation problem, right? And it has to do with tax competition, for example. You're competing for tax revenue, but at the same time, businesses are seeking to escape from paying taxes. And so if New York State doesn't tax, but New York City taxes, right? So firms might want to move out of New York City and into New York State, as an example. But then at the same time, what if you need to be in a specific jurisdiction? What if you have to be in New York City, right? So how does New York City lure these firms to New York, right? And so it has to compete with other jurisdictions, right? It has to compete, in fact, with other cities, other major cities. In fact, and that's why you've seen over the last few decades, financial sectors open up in different places, and banking industry has moved away from these very high tax cities and into lower tax places like Charlotte, North Carolina, for example, where you're paying lower taxes, lower property taxes, and lower taxes in general. Some of these states don't even have state taxes, and you don't have to pay city taxes, and so this has generated tremendous amounts of tax competition. So again, states use tax policy to increase the tax base, right? They will lower their taxes to lure new firms into their states. This creates often these multi-jurisdictional taxation creates difficulties in deciding how much income is attributed to economic activity in that jurisdiction. Who New York City, for example, generates billions of dollars in economic activity. So how much of that should go to New York City and how much of that should go to the state? And a lot of the, when you have sharing income, revenue sharing, it can lead to some problems from these multi layers, right, of tax revenue. And these different tax rates that often are imposed may result in distorted decisions, right? Because you have a tax rate in one jurisdiction in the city, and then another one in the county, and then another one, or maybe not in the county, but in the state. And so you end up having to make decisions solely based on tax rates and not other economic factors that may be more important. Maybe factors that have to do with efficiency, location efficiency, or distributive efficiency, and yet you're making decisions based on taxes only. So it may lead to distorted decisions, not only from the businesses but also from the politicians and from the public sectors themselves. Okay, Chapter 28. Chapter 28 is on fiscal deficits and government debt. This is the last chapter of the book. So Chapter 28, question 28.1 asks, what has given rise to fiscal deficits? Well, as we've talked about in this class, we know that the U.S. generally runs fiscal deficits, right? With a few exceptions throughout history, the U.S. has the budget has enjoyed surpluses, but for the most part, the U.S. runs on a fiscal budget deficit. And so, why have fiscal deficits been so difficult to reduce? What are the central economic issues in the debate, and how deficits should be reduced? Okay, so why are these deficits so hard, and how should we reduce them? Well, the rise of fiscal deficits has had many, many explanations. Generally, though, we have seen a reduced federal taxes, right? So firms and individuals, because of the way that our tax code is designed, it allows for so many exemptions, right? That people are able to avoid taxes. The tax avoidance rates have increased significantly because the tax code has allowed it. And so you end up paying a lower tax rate than what you are, quote unquote, bound legally have to pay, because your effective tax rate is actually lower than your regulatory tax rate. Higher defense spending. We've seen in the 20th century, from World War II to the present, spending on defense skyrocketed considerably. And so defense spending is discretionary spending. And so this is one of the areas that has increased our expenditures considerably over the last 50, 60 years. We've also are spending a lot more on social spending, on elderly programs and programs for welfare programs, programs for the elderly. The American population is getting older. Because of the baby boomers, right? The baby boomers are now retiring, and so we are now having to spend more of our income, more of our budget on these retirees. This, of course, has also led to increasing healthcare expenditures for the same reasons, right? More retirees. In fact, there's a lot less workers now per retirees than there ever was in the United States. And so the ratio of retirees to workers been reduced significantly. We've also seen our national debt skyrocket over the last 20, 30 years. And so that has led to higher interest payments on that debt, which also come out of that budget and have to be paid no matter what. And so that has made it more difficult and impossible to keep this, to reduce these deficits and perhaps turn them into surpluses. And of course, the unavoidable economic downturns that happen, right? You can always count on recessions. At some point, recessions will occur. It's just part of the business cycle. And so economic downturns lead to low output, low productivity, low GDP. And of course, when you have all of these other programs that have to be paid out and have to be financed by law, you end up having to borrow to be able to finance them or increase taxes. But of course, increasing taxes in recessions is catastrophic. So you end up having to borrow as the only solution for that. What are the procedural reforms that have been proposed to ensure that deficits do not emerge in the future? And what are the problems with these reforms? So the government does a lot of things to try and manage the deficits, right? Among these, for example, the government has tried improving the budgetary process through Budget Enforcement Act and scoring. Okay, maybe a line item veto, for example, where the president will veto certain parts of the budget. Right, you know that the budget is has to be approved by the president. And so the president might veto one part of the budget that he or she at some point, hopefully, deems unnecessary or inappropriate. And so this is one way to improve the budgetary process, make it perhaps more efficient, more frugal, perhaps, less wasteful, so to speak. And then, of course, the balanced budget amendment, which has been negotiated or talked about and discussed. Should we have a balanced budget amendment? And of course, those who are opponents of a balanced budget amendment always support the claim that in recessionary periods, right, the balanced budget amendment can do more harm than good because it will create constitutional limitations on economic policy, and that could be detrimental to the nation and to the republic in the long run. All right, so what are the long-term problems facing the U.S. and other high-income countries that, if not adequately addressed, are likely to result in a deficit problem emerging in the future, even if the deficit is reduced now? Of course, and this, I guess we can answer both of these questions because they are linked. What are the long-term consequences of chronic government deficits? And so, in thinking about these questions, it's hard to come out with the right solution that will guarantee the best outcome possible. So all you can do is manage, try and manage, for example, long-term growth, right? Long-term problems are linked directly with economic GDP output. And so the idea, if we are to manage our deficits, and we cannot control the mandatory spending that makes up most of our budget, and because those programs and those outlays have to be provided for by law, so those things we cannot control. The one thing we can control is the economy. How do we promote economic growth and output and efficiency and productivity so that these economic forces generate higher incomes, higher tax income, higher tax revenue. And as long as we are able to generate tax revenue, we are going to be able to either eat away at these deficits or finance them, continue to pay the debt, the interest on the debt, and they keep them sustainable. They may not be the best thing that the optimal situation, but it'll certainly be a sustainable situation. Of course, because we cannot do away with some of these mandatory spending programs. Now, on that note, even though there are many of these programs are required by law, we should though revisit the idea of entitlement programs and to what extent are these entitlement programs really doing what they are intended to do? Are they generating the right outcome? Are they generating the right effect that we want them to? Are they creating the correct incentives, right? Or are they creating perverse incentives? And should we do away with some of these entitlement programs, or maybe change the way that they are, the ways that they are structured, to eliminate some of these negative externalities or these inefficiencies that are associated with them? This would certainly be helpful for the long-term management of the debt, right? But ultimately, it's about keeping the debt in control, right? You're going to have ups and downs in the economy. You're going to face crises in the future, and so you have to manage these, and sometimes you have to spend. But the idea is that in the long run, or over many years, that you keep the debt in control so that it doesn't become a serious factor that might affect the credibility of the nation, of the republic's economic situation and health, and that it still is able to generate demand for not only domestic investment but also investment from foreigners, right? Foreign companies and foreign investors still trusting the dollar, the value of the dollar, and still trusting the U.S. as a viable place and to house their value, their investment. Okay, so it's really about managing those different forces. Okay, so to summarize, fiscal federalism is complicated. It is a marble cake, and like all of the different intergovernmental relations, the spending and revenue sharing and determining the incidence and who bears the burden, these are issues that are not easily solved and simply have to be managed in the best way we can. There will be some inefficiencies, there always are, and all we can count on all we can work for is to try and choose the best way, the best tax policy that will give us the lowest amount or the lowest level of an excess burden, right? Thinking about the government's role in redistribution, remembering that public choice is a factor, and voters will vote along those lines, right? And also considering the long-term impacts of fiscal decisions, tax policy, not only how it affects us today, and the republic today and the citizens of today, but also what kind of an impact our tax and fiscal policy will have on the American citizens of tomorrow. Okay? So this concludes our lecture for this week, and it concludes the class. I hope that you enjoyed it, and as always, God bless and take care.